Well, Daryl James, thank you very much. Good to see
Yeah,
you
yeah,
again.
yeah.
Um, we've done this before, and I think for viewers who haven't seen you, let's um, let's start at the beginning. I'm going to make you um, recount the stuff you've been through as a military person, um, leading up to your experiences in the underground bases.
Yeah, well, I joined the military in January of '99, and I was in battalion for 5 years. And then in 2004, in the spring of 2004, I re-enlisted. I was on a base called JMF RAF St. Maughan, Joint Maritime Force for the U.S. Navy, Royal Air Force. Um, yeah, it was just first thing that happened was I had to escort some civilian workers from the corporation Siemens into the underground base. I actually worked in the garage outside the base. And the first worker said, I'm not going through that bloody thing. It was a scanner, they called it, but it looked like a metal detector you would see at an airport or something like that. And so they walked around it. And so I tried to walk around it as well. And there was a guard, and he said, no, you walk through. So I walked through it, and I watched them fix a pump, and that was it. And then I had a 0 to 4 a.m. watch on a Friday. Um, I met Michael Aquino. He was at the quarterdeck, which is like the lobby of the base. That's where the entrance to the underground base was. Um, he was looking through some papers. I think it was probably whatever that scanner was that scanned me. He was probably looking through that. I think he just wanted to see me, like personally. And we talked for a little bit, and he kind of creeped me out. And I just told him I'm going on another round, and because I was doing rover watch and walked around the base, and that was it. But then the next Friday, I had another 0 to 4 a.m. watch. And when that happened, the petty officer of the watch pointed at the computer screen. And he said, what do you think about that? And it looked like a picture, like a black and white picture of a stereotypical gray. And it looked like he was in a room looking up at a camera. And I said, where did you get that off the internet? And he said, no, look. And next to the sliding glass doors, there was this large window that stopped like 6 inches from the ceiling and about 6 inches from the floor. And it was like an office room behind it. Like I had a table with some chairs, and it was this gray standing by, in this room behind this window. And it was actually kind of light brown, like a khaki brown. It had like a hue of pink about it. It had a fold of skin going from its tear ducts to its cheekbones, and it just looked black eyes, um, no nose, small mouth, no ears. And the petty officer of the watch said, do you mind if it comes in here? And I said, does it mind if I look at it? And he said no. But when he said no, I heard no in my head, like it was communicating with me telepathically. It walked out of that room, walked through the sliding glass door. That same guard was behind it. It had like a small pistol in its hand, what I thought was a pistol. I kept on saying gun. I just got back from Iraq. I served time in Iraq. I stood up and I said gun, gun, gun. And they all said it's not a gun. And it put its hand out and showed it to me. And it looked like a silver pistol. I didn't know what it was. And I noticed the guard, he had his weapon at the ready. He wasn't pointing it at me, but it was no longer over his shoulder. It was in his hand. So I sat back down, and I was thinking, is this like a syringe? Is it going to inject me with something? Is it going to like take a sample from me? I didn't know what it was. And it had very long fingers, like it had to walk in like C shapes, kind of. Its fingers are so long. It would have drug him on the ground. Like he could pick them off the ground without bending his knees or back. Thick knuckles. And it was actually a drill. It looked like a silver polished kind of small drill. Because there was this small Dell computer on the ground, and it took it apart quickly, like very quickly, like a machine. Like it didn't have to guide the bit in or anything like that. It just hit the screws on the head every time, and it was catching the screws with the other hand. It slid the top off, put it on the ground, took out 2 gigs of RAM, reached up on the table. There were already 2 more other gigs waiting for it. Grabbed them, slid them back in, put the top back on, and it kind of flicked its fingers forward and kind of set the screws in between its fingers every time, like perfectly, and was able to just put it back together. And then it just turned around and it looked at me. And I kind of, I looked that way and it moved its head for me. And I looked the other way and it moved its head. And I looked at its hands and it moved its hands back and forth for me. And I got kind of almost bored with it. And I remember I tried to touch it because it was almost like I was trying to make this real. Like, it was so unreal. I wanted physical contact with it to make it real. And I remember the petty officer of the watch said, "No, don't touch it." So I leaned back in my chair and I just kind of looked around and I was almost kind of bored with it after a while. And it walked back in, walked back into the underground base. And I was pinching myself on the thigh with like my thumb and finger as hard as I could. And the petty officer of the watch said, "Do you think you're dreaming? Why are you pinching yourself?" And I said, "No, I want to be able to, remember this in case you wipe my memory." And he said, "No, you'll remember this. Don't worry." And he started asking me things like, he said, "Well, you said you're smart." And I said, "Really?" He goes, "Yeah, like really smart." I said, "Well, how smart?" Like 140, 150 IQ. And he said, "More like 190, 195. And I said, "Well, how do you know that?" And he said, "You see that machine? You call it a scanner, like the metal detector I walked through." He said, it tells everything. He said, "You smoke," 'cause I smoked at the time. And he said, "But you don't have any clots because you drink," 'cause I drank at the time. And he showed me like these color coded lines almost. They kind of wiggled a little bit and they're different colors. And he said, "See, you're the second smartest guy on base." And, there's one right above me. I was right below it. There was a gap. And then there was like the rest of the guys. And he said, "Do you have any hobbies?" And I said, "Well, I used to play classical guitar." And he said, "Oh, they'll like that." I said, "Like, who, what do you mean, who? What do you mean they'll like that?" And he said, "Well, there's Germans up there." And I said, "Like Germans from like Germany?" And he's like, "Yeah." He's like, "Mostly from the 30s and 40s, but yeah, Germans from Germany." And he said that they were in the moon and beyond. And he really didn't call it space. He just kind of said up there. And then he kind of went on about, and there's others too. There's others out there. And he said, "Well, with your scores, you'll be an officer, so you'll have plenty of time to practice." I really didn't even know what it was still like something I was trying to process. Like it was something so difficult to believe. What the things he was saying to me were kind of going over my head. I was just thinking like, what is this? And I remember I kind of even like kind of freaked out and said, "We should tell people about this. This is, this is insane." And he told me to calm down and go for a walk. And,
Yeah, right.
that was probably about the end of that day.
What's was he referring to the Germans after World War II who were dispatched throughout the world in Operation Paperclip?
I believe he was talking about paperclip, and I remember I was talking to the XO before I got out of the military, and he was talking. He told me things like the point of World War II in the eyes of the Germans at the time wasn't really to be won. It was to like prolong the war as long as possible to get everything they found from Antarctica to South America, like Argentina and Brazil and things like that. You hear there's all these German communities in South America. And the Maria Orsic thing with the channeling and talking to ETs, that was true. And they told her that where you find all these you know wrecked ships and just different sites in Antarctica and things like that. And they dug it all up and reverse engineered it and figured out. I heard about the bell and all that stuff, the German bell. And yeah, so it was like he told me that that was real, that was like a true thing that happened.
The bell I've heard of, but you're saying that there was a particular person who had insight or remote viewing so they could see these things that occurred?
Yeah, like I looked it up myself, and it was like Hitler banned all secret societies except for the Brill Society, and they were primarily women that never cut their hair like their entire life. They were like born into this cult kind of this society, and so they never cut their hair. They had hair like down to their feet, and they believed that their channeling powers came from their hair. And yeah, it was pretty much like a group of women with maybe like one or two men, and they were able to like tap into like ETs because I kind of believe, just from my own experiences, that it's not only in a different part of our universe, it's kind of like in a different, I don't know if you'd call it dimension or density. It's like in a different reality. So you could call it, because I found out later that we're in third density, fourth density is like astral plane, spirit world, fifth density is like more technologically and more spiritually advanced, things like that. So it's different than the reality that we think of, and it is kind of more of a spiritual reality. So doing things like channeling and everything like that would make sense to communicate with these beings. And
Um,
yeah.
oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna lead up to the point where the executive officer guy, his name was Robert, his first name was Robert, he came to my garage, asked if he could speak to me, which is very uncommon, with a second in command of the entire base. That they usually call you to their office, but they don't come to you. And we were walking for a while, and he said, what did you think? It's very interesting, isn't it? Talking about the drone I saw. I said, yes, sir. He started going on about there's something called the 20-year and back, where you do 20 years. We put you in the program for 20 years, send you back in time 20 years, wipe your mind, age regress you 20 years, and you wake up in bed like nothing happened. I remembered I could believe everything except for the age regression, and I even said that to him. I said, "Sir, I could believe going back in time, but age regression, hard to believe." He said, "After what you just saw, you think that's hard to believe?" And I said, "Touche, sir, but yes, well, it's true." And he really wasn't interested in convincing me any further. He just went on to the next point. He went on about Gary McGinnon. He was from Scotland, the UK area, and he hacked into NASA. And this was only at the time a year or two ago, so it was pretty much a current event still. But it got swept under the rug because the whole Iraq War was going on, and it was pretty easy to sweep under the rug. And he was able to find things like ranks and social security numbers of extraterrestrial officers, different shipments that were use of like toxic chemicals and things like that going into Solar Warden, cigar-shaped craft over the moon, things like that, pictures of cigar-shaped craft over the moon. He found all this stuff, and he hacked into NASA, the U.S. Navy, and the U.S. Army. And in the U.S. Navy files, he found this. And the executive officer said it's all true, all of it. He said the only reason they didn't extradite him is because if they would have extradited him, he wouldn't have been able to call witnesses. And if he was able to call witnesses, it would have blew the lid off Solar Warden. So they just kind of swept it under the rug with the war and everything. And he said with my scores, my IQ scores, I could become a pilot of a 4 kilometer long starship and make commander. And he told me they look similar to the Battlestar Galactica ships. And it was almost like a kind of thing where these other people don't know anything. They don't know how the universe works. I can show you how the universe works. Do you want to know how the universe works? It was kind of like, that's kind of like how he introduced me to it. And I thought about it, and I let him know. I said, that machine I walked through, it was able to, scan you, your IQ, your clots, everything else. You could see if you had clots. I said my dad died of a widowmaker, a heart attack, where he had no warning when I was 19 years old. I said if we had technology like that, it would have saved his life. And he went on about population control. And I said, well, there has to be a side that wants to release it to the public. And he said, well, there is. And I said, well, if you can get me on that side, I'll do it. So I shook his hand, saluted him. He started walking away. He said, one more thing, Mr. James. You're going to be escorted by a reptile, and he's big. And I really didn't know what he was talking about. Like, I didn't know anything about ETs. I saw, like, the gray before, whatever they call them, drones, on covers of books and things like that. But I watched the show B when I was a kid, but that was about it. And there are also different events that happen in the barracks that make it more solid, more concrete for me. One time we were playing Halo, the video game Halo, in the barracks, and one of the guys said, "Hey, did you see that reptile today?" And another one said, "Yeah, he was big." And another one said he talked funny too. And I said, "What?" And they said, "Yeah, there's reptiles on the ground. They talk to you." I even said, like, there's four-legged lizards, that walk around and talk to you, because I didn't understand it. And they said, "No, they're humanoid like us. They walk upright and they walk around." And I just thought it was because I was a new guy and they were messing with me, so I didn't really think about it very much. And then like the next day, we were playing Halo again in the barracks, and I found out later the command was kind of like getting people to say things to me to kind of like, you know, acclimatize me to the situation because I didn't work in the underground base. And one of the guys said, "Yeah, man, I joined the secret space program and I was on the moon and there were all these brothels and it was great." And I was thinking maybe the XO told this to everybody and said you're going to become a pilot, and I just wind up like working in mines or something like that. And I said, well, the XO himself came up to me and said that I have 195 IQ and I become pilot of a 4 kilometer long starship. I said, did he say that to you? And he said, no. He's like, I just volunteered. I just did it. I worked in the underground base and I just volunteered for it. He said, they're going to take care of you. You're going to be up there. You saying things like that. And then all of a sudden there was like a feedback loop kind of in the room, and a voice just kind of happened, and it said something like, "Now hear this, now hear this. You are now in violations of Articles 7 and 8 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. If you do not stop right now, you'll be charged up to $100,000 of fines and 10 years in prison. That'll be all." And it went away, and I said, "Well, what?" I said, "Is there a speaker in here?" I looked around, and they said, "No, with their technology, they don't need speakers." And I said, "Well, what was that?" And nobody wanted to talk. They said they're listening. We should stop talking now. And then somebody came up to me the next day and said, "Did you hear that voice in the room?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, the radio tower by the underground base, those rectangular blocks, said that's 5G technology. He said it's something experimental on this base that they're using, and they can create a microwave beam, put it into a room. They can look around, they can hear everything, and they can talk if they want to talk to you if they want. And so that was like something new to me as far as 5G. And then it was like the Friday before I was going to join, or actually no, the Thursday night, and I was in like the break room area of the barracks, like the TV room, and I was watching TV on the couch, and the guy who lived across from the break room, the TV room, he had his door open, and it was almost one of the situations where he wanted to hear me, like he was talking to someone else, but he wanted me to overhear it, and he said something like, "You're going to be taken into a room and strapped to a chair. It's a density chamber." He said most of the ETs we deal with are fifth density, and we're much too slow and we're not smart enough to be able to work with them properly. So it'll make you stronger, faster. Your IQ will go up 200 points and you'll become more of a collective. And then it became Friday night, and I had another 0 to 4 a.m. watch, and that same first class petty officer was there. He was like an overweight guy with a mustache, and he told me he joined the program, and that's why he was there. And he had me sign like a stack of papers, and it was already X'd off, like initial here, sign here. It was like signing a mortgage kind of. And I started reading it, and it said things like, the consciousness of the first party now belongs to the second party, and I got kind of creeped out that I don't want to sign this. And he said, "You're already back there, so just sign the damn papers." Meaning, like, I had already come back from the 20-year and back, and I was like being age regret. That was what he was referring to. And I realized I was in a time loop, and it was, kind of strange feeling. And I said something to myself like, "I'm doing this for Dad," and I just signed it. And I sat down, and he got on the phone. He said, "All right, send him in." And I waited a couple minutes. I was kind of daydreaming, and then all of a sudden, there was like this big brown reptile behind that same big window next to the sliding glass doors. And he had like ridges going down his head, almost like mohawks. Mouth was straight across, went up, gold alligator eyes, 9.5 feet tall, I'd say. Very large, very big shoulder muscles. He was wearing like a tight blue suit. You could kind of barely see his teeth, a little bit. And he said, "Go with him." And I said something like, "Jesus Christ, like he's not going to eat me, is he?" And he said, "He's much bigger and stronger than you. If he wanted to, he would have, killed you and eaten you by now." And when I said that, it was like it had a big sigh. Like it took like a 3 second inhale and a 3 second exhale. It was like a 9 to 5, and he could hear me behind this glass. And I said, he can't, can he read my mind? He said, yes, he can read your mind. And in my head, I said, sorry about that. And then he eventually walked out. He came out of that room and he walked into like the quarter deck, and I got to see like he was like there, really big. So I got up, and he had another guard behind him, a different guy this time. And I got up and I started walking with him. The guard kept on butt stroking me over and over, like hit me in the back with the butt of the rifle. I didn't realize the situation I was in. I guess I was, like a slave. I didn't realize that that's what this was at the
Why
time.
was he doing that?
Just to be a jerk. Because at first I thought it was because I was looking around, and then he kept doing it. So I just stared directly at the reptile's back as it walked, and he still kept doing it. So I don't know. I think he was just, it's just I found out later he was an off-world German, and he was dressed like English military, and he was just being a jerk. And that's what the military calls like the Germans in space, the off-world Germans. And so I said, please stop hitting me. I'm not looking around. Stop hitting me. I didn't turn around and look at him. I just said it. And he did it again. So I turned around, I grabbed his weapon, and I put my leg behind his legs, and I threw him on the ground, knocked the wind out of him. I held the weapon up over his head by the barrel, and I said, if you hit me with this weapon, one more time, I'm going to shove it up your ass sideways. And I heard the reptile say, leave us, in a very deep voice. And he looked at me and looked at his weapon, and then I just held it out, he grabbed it, walked away. When I turned around, the reptile was like right in my face, kind of, his stomach pretty much was right in my face. And I looked up and I could see like his chest muscles, and like I saw his eyes like kind of glaring at me over his like chest muscles. And the first thing that came to my head was, I'm sorry what I said before, you're much more civilized than him. And his eyes were squinting, and then his eyes kind of opened up normal, and he just turned around and he said, follow me. And I followed him. And we eventually got to like a kind of like a catwalk, 3 steps going up, and it was like one of those watertight doors, I guess you would say, with the wheel on it and everything you see on ships. And I walked in and I saw this chair. And when I was in elementary school, we had like the DARE program when I was a kid. And they put like a gas chamber chair in a trailer, and the police brought it to our school when I was around 6. And it had the bucket under it, and the chain that dipped the chemical in it, and the cyanide and the gas coming out. And it really scared me as a kid to think all these people died on this chair. When I saw that chair, it was big and it had the holes on it, and it had straps for your arm, your wrist, and your ankles. And I was like, I'm not going in there. And I tried to run, and it grabbed me and threw me in, and I was wrestling with it. And I think it headbutted me the first time, knocked me out for a second, and I came to, and it was doing the straps on my legs now. And I kind of got off it and was undoing my strap, my arm that was strapped in. I had my right arm strapped in, but not my left, and I was undoing the strap. And he like put his hand on my chest, and I could feel his fingers up here and his palm right here. And he just pushed me back in the chair, and he kind of made like a alligator mating call noise, I guess you would say, where you could feel it in your chest, like the percussion, but you can't hear it. But then as he got closer, you could hear the rumble. And he said, don't make me hit you again. And when he got real close, I jammed my thumb in his eye because I was like trying to get out no matter what. Like I thought I was trying to kill me, and I was trying to get away. And he just pushed against me and collapsed my chest and pushed against my heart, and I just blacked out. And came to, and everything was all strapped in. He said something like, I'm sorry I have to do this to you. He said that to me. I remember he looked at me and said, I'm sorry I have to do this to you. He walked out, and he closed the door and tightened the wheel. And then I felt almost like a out-of-body experience in the sense of weightlessness, cold, and then like complete peace. It's kind of like how it felt. It felt almost like my soul was kind of coming out of my body. And then I just woke up like out of the blue. I was still in the chair. The straps were undone. And I saw this guy look like a Gestapo. Like his hair was like slicked back, blonde, sides of his head were shaved. He was wearing like a black leather trench coat, and he was facing me and kind of talking, like gesturing like he was talking, but he wasn't saying anything. And the reptile's back was towards me, and he was doing the same thing, like, talking with his hands, but not really saying anything. And he was actually a first class petty officer on the base. And I found out later from the XO that like Germany actually won World War II. So they actually had what we would think of as spies, but they're not really spies because we're kind of like a vassal state for the off-world Germans almost, the United States. So it's like it's completely legitimate that they're there, I guess you would say. But they're wearing U.S. Navy uniforms. They really don't speak with an accent. Because have you ever heard a German person speak English? They speak American English. Their English sounds more like American English than English, British English. And yeah, like we had a senior chief with glasses, and he was skinny with a mustache. He was a off-world German, that's first class petty officer. The S3, who was the fourth in command, who was lieutenant, he was an off-world German. The master chief of the base, he was an off-world German. The doctor, who was lieutenant of the base, he was an off-world German. So like all these people in all these sensitive areas of the base were actually like kind of like spies, but not really because we were defeated. It took them longer to defeat us than they wanted. They kind of infiltrated us with the whole Project Paperclip thing and defeated us that way. And yeah, so I saw that guy. He was kind of gesturing to the reptile like he was talking, but he wasn't talking. And I slid off the chair. And the first thing, it was really weird. I didn't remember any of my past really. Like I could still reason and everything like that, but whoever I was like gone. Like my history was gone. And I was very loopy and everything was different. Colors were brighter. It was like a lot of information was being put into my mind at once. It was, they say your color spectrum goes up, your frequency of sound goes up, your night vision goes up. Not only your intelligence, but like all your perception of reality kind of goes up. And I was kind of woozy and I fell down. I said, "Can I go to bed now?" That was like the first thing that came out of my mouth. And I fell down on my hands and knees and I saw his boots going to my peripheral. And he said I should have you executed for what you did to my man. I passed out. I kind of fell on the ground, and the reptile said it doesn't matter. He doesn't remember. And next thing I knew, I woke up, and the reptile was carrying me like a duffel bag, kind of like under its arm, and my head was facing towards the bag. And I was on my bladder, and I said, I have to pee. He put me down for a second so I could pee real quick. He wasn't listening to me, and I just passed out. And then I saw something bright, like a bright light, and then all of a sudden, when I opened my eyes, I was in like a medical room, like on a medical bed with like a hospital light in my face and things like that. And a woman gave me a physical, and Robert told me that was a looking glass portal that took me to the interior of the moon. So that's the beginning of like the introduction to my story, and that's how it started. I started off on the moon for 3 months for as punishment, mine to the moon for 3 months as punishment for poking the reptile in the eye. And then I got picked up by the Dark Fleet, Knockwaffen, and then after that I was in Solar. And I was in the Moons for 3 months, Knockwaffen for 2 years, and the rest of the time I was with them, or Solar Warden. Robert kind of said with them.
What is that middle um portion you spoke of? The moon and then what?
Knockwaffen, Dark Fleet. It's like off-world Germans. They're kind of like mercenaries for the Draconian Empire, like the reptiles. They're like their own personal kind of like mercenary force. They were the ones, I guess, they got in contact with that gave them what they wanted. I think the other ETs only offered them things like karmic weapons in the sense of like if you try to drop a bomb on Berlin, it would just send it back up and blow that plane up. Like they got in contact with positive ETs to begin with, and then negative ETs like Greys and Reptiles got in contact with them. And they offered them actual weapons, and part of the deal was they wanted a lot of people, and as like a workforce, as mercenaries, and maybe that was like a big part of Germany at the time was doing these really radical like breeding programs where they were trying to get this specific kind of people like Aryan, where they were checking their nose and everything else. You see like the propaganda movies and things like that. I think maybe a lot of those people got put into these programs and these off-world programs.
What I'm hearing from you is one, that we didn't win World War II, and that win or the supposed win was for public consumption. But the off-world Germans who have aligned themselves with these ETs are the ones who are actually in control. Is that correct, the way I'm expressing it?
Yeah, because it seemed like the XO, who was, he told me later on he was from the future or something like he was from like 2580. but he seemed to have no real power. And these off-world Germans seemed to have more power, and of course the reptiles over them had even more power. But I we won the war in the beginning. We won the battle, I guess is what you would say. But they won the war. You know, World War II was just the battle, and they won the actual war. And that, on the anniversary of the surrender of Germany, where you see like the glowing spears, it was like in the papers. It's in, you could find it like it was in actual, and it was over Washington D.C.
Hmm.
That was the Germans, the off-world Germans. Like they came to D.C. and they forced, the United States complete surrender to them, and that's what that was about. They were showing like their military might, and basically the United States surrendered right then and there.
When the reptile had you in this chair, was there some kind of procedure done to you where all of your senses were enhanced? Is that when this occurred?
Yes, yes. It was just going up to fifth density. Like going up to fifth density is like, I don't know. You can look down timelines. You become very telepathic. Look down timelines, like see somebody's future, see your own future. Um, I found myself kind of sometimes when I was in the program, I'd kind of go off into like a daydream, and I'd go 5 years into my own future and almost be like in my body in 5 years from now. And then me at that time realizing that this is happening, like realizing that like myself from the past kind of inhabiting my body, and realizing that's happening, and then going back into the present and not even knowing how that happened. Things like that. Yeah, just color spectrum goes up, your intelligence goes up, you learn very quickly, you learn a lot faster than you could before. But it's just the whole reality is different. It's difficult to explain. I think that's why people have problems remembering the 20-year and back. I think it's less about a mind wipe, a memory wipe, and kind of trying to put fifth density memories into like third density words, because it's like so much different. It's just not like your entire outlook on the universe and your entire outlook on reality is completely different.
Well, it doesn't translate properly, probably.
Exactly. Yeah, it's two different worlds. It's almost like, and Robert kept on saying to me, the XO, when he was trying to get me back in the chair because he realized I had my memories still before I was getting out of the military, and he kept on saying, Daryl, that's not you. You don't understand. Like that isn't you. And in a sense, he was correct, because it was just like a me, like on a different level of reality, maybe even a different dimension and things like that. It was like a different universe almost. So when he told me like that's not you, he was, telling the truth in a sense that really wasn't me.
Do you have a heightened sense of, say, intuition now and foresight?
Intuition and foresight. I mean, I don't know. I maybe I block it. Maybe it was blocked by me, or maybe it was blocked by something else. But I think like Mike Lucchino, he's later on in the story. I think he blocked me. I think he was able to put blocks on me, some sort of blockage. But also, it's like, I mean, I had something that happened to me. The reason I didn't go into the chair, go down to the fifth density properly, and Robert found this out later because he looked down my timeline and he realized I had suppressed memories I would remember in the future, and I started remembering different things. And I knew this girl named Jen, who my sister knew her, and she was, I don't know, 4 years older than me. And she invited me to a Halloween party when I was 11, and she was 3 or 4 years. I don't know. She was probably 14 or 15. And my dad and I were telepaths. Like that was like a big thing I remember. And my dad taught me that pretty much since I was, born, it was just something we could do. And Jen can do it as well. And we used to talk to her in the house, and she like liked us a lot. And I went to this Halloween party. My sister went as well, and she grabbed me by the wrist immediately and took me into her mother's bedroom. And her mom was like putting on like, looked like a mix between Elvira and Stevie Nicks going to a Halloween party, like, look like a mix between it. And she like lifted up. She said, "Is this him?" And Jen said, "Yes." And we were just talking like telepathically. And she like lifted up my chin up, grabbed my chin and kind of lifted my head up so she could see into my eyes. And she said, "You said the father can do it?" And she said, "Yes." She said, "Well, what about the mother?" She said, "Not as much." She said, "And the sister?" And she said, "No." And then the woman just like locked eyes with me, and like the whole room kind of like got engulfed with like orange and like red and flecks of blue. It looked like almost like fire. And I remember some of the girls were screaming outside, like in the TV room area of the house. I could hear it through the door, and they could see it as well. And the woman kind of shook my head and said something like, "You're a powerful little boy. You know that, don't you?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Good, now go play." And whatever she did, and like for years after that, it felt like I was hallucinating. Like, and I was 11. I had never like hallucinated before. And it was just everything was different, and like colors were different, and everything was strange. And I could kind of see like humanoid figures that weren't there and things like that. I could see different things, almost like they were a little bit out of focus. And I found out later from Robert that whatever that woman did to me, and I found out later from Jen that, and my sister that, her dad was like high ranking Italian mafia from New York, and they wound up going back to New York later on after she graduated high school. And her mother was a Kabbalist, like Jewish black magic. And whatever she did to me, she like pushed me kind of into partial fifth density. That's what Robert said. He said, "You're partially in fifth, you're not completely in fifth density, but you're partial." So it made like life difficult for me basically, because I'm in like a third density reality, and I'm like partially in fifth. And it just makes the life like more difficult to live that way.
So you, from birth, you innately have or had extrasensory perception. Maybe that's why you were chosen to participate in this project that you eventually got into in the military. Maybe that's why they chose you for your IQ and for your ESP qualities.
Yeah, because when I joined the program, I was in the presence of them, like the Pleiadians. Robert called them like Tijetans. Nordics is what the military calls them. Look like us, except for their eyes are like a fifth larger. They're usually blue-eyed, blonde hair. When you're in like the presence of an elder ET, I would say, they live the Pleiadians live over 3,000 years. He told me that. And once they get to about 2,000 years, and they kind of reach they're going into like their older age. If you're in their presence, they can actually go back in time in your timeline. All ETs can go forward in time on the timeline, but only like the more experienced elder ones can go back in time. And yeah, like since I was like with them, they were able to do that, go back in time in my timeline and kind of put little things. And I think that whatever that was that woman did to me, they wanted that to happen. That was something they did, because whenever my aura or whatever it was kind of blew up and it became orange in the room, I remember I saw like past her eyes almost. I locked, because it was weird. All I could see was like her eyes, and then everything else was like engulfed in like flames.
Hmm.
And kind of like past her eyes, I saw these like blonde hair, blue eye, like a group of people kind of just looking at me.
Hmm.
I didn't understand what that meant. And yeah, in my younger years, I remember one of my first dreams was I thought like an angel was judging me or something. Like I thought I had died. And I was like very young. I was probably 3 years old, and I was crying in my dream. And I said, "Am I going to hell?" And it was just like a blonde man with long blonde hair. And he smiled and he said, "No, you're not going to hell." And I remember with my father, when I was about 4, watching Sesame Street with him. And he was talking to me telepathically on the couch. And he said, "Your sister used to know how to do this, but as she got older, she forgot. Do you think you'll remember?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll remember." And he got up and walked to the kitchen, and he turned around and he looked at me and he said, "If you can remember how to do this, you'll be able to see your future and the future of others." That's how he put it. As you get older, you'll be able to see your future, the future of others.
So these special gifts are in your family, obviously.
Yeah, yeah. And like he said, he got it from his mom. He could do it through his mother. And I never knew her. She died before I was born, but they were from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, like Scranton area. And she was kind of like a midwife. She could set bones. She made like salves and ointments. She knew how to make teas to kill parasites and things like that, like bone set weed tea and things, dandelions, things like that.
Right.
But he told me a story about he was, it was a bunch of, typical Great Depression family. He was a Depression baby, so they had like 8 kids, and they were playing at a lake, and one of his brothers cut his foot open badly, like a flap of skin was kind of hanging off his foot. And he said his mother just came up and she like put direct pressure on the wound and kind of said a prayer under her breath. And he said within like a few seconds the bleeding stopped, and she just carried him back to the house and like stitched him up. Like she could do things like that.
He was a healer.
Yes, yes.
Oh, amazing. That's wonderful. So that makes sense to me as to why they would choose you for this kind of mission. I want to continue on from the experience with the reptilian after the experience on the chair. From that point, you said you went to the moon. How did you get to the moon from this base in England, right?
Yeah, it was a looking glass technology. It was explained to me. It's like you can either look at the looking glass, you can look at different periods of time on Earth, or you can go up to the moon, things like that. And you can either observe, you can observe the future, you can observe the past, or you can step through the looking glass. That's why it's called looking glass, like Alice in Wonderland through the looking glass. And you can just go into that space of time, during that, that time that you're observing. And it's almost like the moon is kind of like a jump off point, and that's why you don't see ships and stuff flying from Earth all the time, because they just put you through a portal that takes you into the moon, and then you take off from like the dark side of the moon after that. So it's almost like a jumping off point for the space program is the moon itself. And it's it was used as mines. It was used, they had brothels in it and things like that, and your only motivation to work was sex. And I was told later on that if the kids' scores weren't high enough, like you had to have at least 110 IQ, which is pretty high, to even be in the mines of the moon, unless you were there specifically for a punishment. People who were there for like, if they wronged some, killed an admiral's daughter or something like that, and he was in this program, you'd be sent there. You wouldn't have your memories wiped. That's what they were going to do to me originally, just for poking this reptile in the eye. That's how considered how low we are. I was going to do 40 years in the mines of the moon. They were just going to send me back in time and age regress me, but allow me to keep all my memories. And he said most of those people commit suicide. But yeah, there's something about the density shift. You have to have at least 110 IQ to be able to handle the density shift. And I remember something they called it density sickness when I was in the moon. It was like you kind of fell back into third density. It was almost like what it was. Like you're it was like the first month this would happen every now and again. And I remember I just saw like a bunch of blur everywhere, and I heard like these high pitched like squeaky voices, like chipmunks almost. And then all of a sudden I came back into fifth density, and this guy was holding me, and he said, "Are you all right? Are you all right?" And I said, "Yeah." And he's like, "It's density sickness." He said, "Don't worry, it'll wear off." So it was almost like, I kind of fell back into the lower density, and all these people were higher fifth density, and they were moving around really fast, and I didn't know what was happening. And it was almost like a relief for my mind. It was like, oh, thank God. Like, it's so, like I said, fifth density is like so much information. It was almost like, oh, because my brain still wasn't used to it, and it kind of like reverted back and came back into the density I was used to. And it was almost like a relief, like not so much information, the process and everything. Not, your mind has to move so fast when you're higher density. But yeah, I mean, and if the kids didn't have like, at least 110, I'm guessing, if not higher, they were used for mainly adrenochrome harvesting in like the mines of the moon. I mean, and the mines of I'm sorry, there's caverns below these underground bases, like caves that were built by ETs, negative ETs and things. And that's where they hold the kids for these like harvesting that drug.
I didn't know that. So that this adrenochrome harvesting is being acquired from children from Earth who have been transported to the moon. Is that
Born
correct?
on the moon, but fairly soon. I remember like seeing like babies being taken away from mothers and things like that as soon as they were considered old enough to not nurse anymore. And that's kind of how it worked. Like these women really weren't allowed to like keep their children or anything like that. So I mean, it was a tough life, yeah. And it was they were born on the moon, and then they were sent back through the looking glass, technology, the portal, and they were put in these caverns that are like these caves that are below these underground bases, and that's what they're used for.
The adrenochrome is shipped back to Earth?
No, it's in the earth where they're being held captive.
Oh, I see.
They're born on the moon, and then once they're done nursing, when they're old enough, like around a year old, once they're considered old enough to not nurse anymore, they send them through this portal that takes them back to the underground bases, and they're put in like dog kennels and like they were feral. I was told they were feral because they were never really held or talked to. Like if they get out of the cage, they'll attack people. They don't know how to speak. They're very white, very pale. Never had a
Yes.
haircut. They have long
Yeah.
matted hair. Yeah.
Yeah, I've read that in the lower levels of these underground bases, whistleblowers have seen kids in cages. So that explains that aspect of it. And it also explains a lot, to some extent, the fact that I just read a few nights ago that there are 30,000 children missing per year in England, and there are 500,000 children missing on average in the United States. Does that account for what is going on with this adrenochrome harvesting?
Well, yeah, I'm sure it's that, but I'm sure it's also probably, you know, sex slave industry just here on the surface. And I'm sure some of it's probably recruiting them into these programs and things like that. Because
Sounds pretty demonic to me.
yeah, yeah, it is. I mean, yeah, taking the kids and everything. Yeah, but a lot of it. I mean, I think some of the people that get taken. I remember Robert explained this to me.
Oh, who is Robert, by the way?
Robert was the executive officer. The guy I first talked
Okay.
to. Yeah, who introduced me to the program and everything like that.
Okay.
He explained to me that these gifted children, and I slipped through the cracks somehow. I was asked if I was homeschooled and things like that. They were surprised I wasn't in the programs at a younger age. But you got these kids in gifted programs and things like that, and they have all these strange stories about going on to like going into bands and like doing these strange things and then coming back and things like that. Um, he explained to me that even the positive ETs deal in that because if they find someone that has like potential, they want them when they're young so they can help them get to like a higher level of potential while they're in these programs. And he said the reasoning is because the negative ones do it and it works, they have to be competitive and they have to keep up. So just because something is positive and negative, people have a concept of good and evil, but it doesn't really work that way. It's like you need both. You need the light and the dark. You need the cold and the hot. You need the balance. You need both. And it's not really good and evil. It's not really seen that way in a higher density. Like third density, you kind of see it that way. In higher density beings, see that it's childish, and it's more like the positive ETs. They have to stay competitive with the negative ETs, and they're not as cruel. And I've heard people say like, oh, Solar Warden is just as bad as Knockwaffen and things like that. But I mean, even like Robert, he was like, no, it's not. It's like night and day is it compared to the cruelty. But yeah, but I mean, there are people that are picked up, maybe taken out of their bedrooms when they're kids and things like that, put in these programs and then sent back in time and age regress and put back into bed like nothing happened. But it's just kind of like they have to do it to stay competitive, if that makes sense, to help us out, to help our world out, to go to the next level, to ascend to the next level.
So you're saying some kids are actually taken and they may experience some years away and then they're returned and regress to their original age when they were taken?
Yeah, and then their mind's wiped and everything else. Yeah, and they're they're put back right in the bed right where they were left off.
Did that happen to you in your experience?
No, because that's what I mean, that first class petty officer, whenever he was showing me the graph of the line with the intelligence chart, he showed me on the computer. He even said, like, he said, were you homeschooled? And I said, no. And he said, well, I guess you just slipped through the cracks because there was no, I guess he was looking through the files and there was no like history on me that was ever in any of these programs. And I think once you join the program, they can't pick you back up. I think there's like rules they have to follow and contracts and things like that. They have to follow these rules.
Let's move on to Mars now. We're getting all over the solar system here. So you're on the moon. Did you make a trip from the moon to Mars, or was there an interim stop?
Well, I mean, yeah, it was what I remember was, yeah, I was working in the mines and Robert was there, the XO, and I didn't recognize him. And he pointed towards me and he said something to like a high ranking German officer. And that high-ranking German officer came up to me with like a device and looked at it, and then he started yelling at that first-class petty officer I told you about, who was always like, giving me a hard time on the moon, in the mines of the moon. And he started yelling at him in German, and then he came up to me and he said, "Follow me." And I basically got processed into like Dark Fleet, and like the off-world German kind of mercenary group. And first I was being trained as a pilot, and then they found out, they looked at like my background, my military background, because a lot of these guys I don't believe were in the military even. A lot of these guys, I think they just got picked up as kids, or maybe they got picked up at a club, maybe they're drunk and they passed out and someone picked them up. Um, yeah, they found out that I had military experience in the Middle East, and then they've made me kind of almost like a sergeant, like breaking in new Germans and new people and stuff like that on Mars. And on Mars, they had like things like, it was mostly, we were looking for, they called them mantises. They look kind of like a praying mantis.
Oh, I've heard about these.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, a lot of mantises and a lot of reptiles. Um, but reptiles aren't always necessarily bad or negative. These were more like a peaceful kind of reptile that were like an inhabitant of Mars. Um, and these mantises were very good at DNA manipulation, and the reptiles wanted them for information, for DNA manipulation, and that's basically what I did. Was I hunted these mantises down, grabbed them, you know, pretty much handcuffed them, waited for like a transporter to come pick them up. There were like these carts that came up. I could pick them up, and they'd take them back, and the ship would take them, and then they would be interrogated, but like using through like kind of like technology to interrogate. So they got exactly what they wanted from them. Then they would just put them back. And it was almost like, if you give us what we want, we won't harm you, but if you don't, we'll wipe you out. And it's kind of like that. It was almost like the way castles were raided back in, medieval times, where, if you surrender your castle, we'll just take what we want, but if you don't, we'll kill all of you. It was kind of like that kind of mentality. And yeah, there were also things like large spiders that were in caves and things like that in the on Mars. The mantises would run into the caves, and they were very telepathic, and they could communicate with these spiders. And I was told that they had about the same IQ as a dog, like they're about as intelligent as a dog, so they could pick up basic commands and things like that. But I usually would just cloak, and they would lose interest in me, almost like an animal. Like the suits they gave you, you could cloak completely invisible, and they would kind of like, they had those two front like legs, like arms almost, the way a spider does. And they'd kind of slam them on the ground and wait and see if you would run to pick up your vibrations. And then they would dart really quick and do it again, slam these appendages on the ground and wait. And if you didn't run, if you just stayed completely still and cloaked, they would just go back into the cave. And they didn't spin webs or anything like that. That's why they lived in caves. They used like the caves to like pick up vibrations. There were a lot of sandstorms and things like that, and they did have like these larger kind of four-legged reptiles, like they looked like monitor lizards and things like that. And they'd run into the caves during sandstorms, and these spiders, that's what they fed on.
So that's an indication that we have invisibility technology.
Oh yeah, yeah, completely invisible. Yeah,
We
completely.
we we have that now in the military.
Oh, I would say so. I mean, yeah, I mean, definitely. And rail guns, I remember we used rail guns for rifles. They had plasma and they had laser, but that was only for like vehicles, if you were expecting vehicles. But for personnel, you basically just had rail guns, which they have those on Navy ships now too, which is basically like almost like a magnetic current that kind of shoots the round out. Instead of using gunpowder, it uses like a powerful like current, like a rail gun. But they're much larger on ships.
These experiences with these reptilians and spiders, was this on Mars or the moon?
This was on Mars, yeah, not on the moon. There were reptiles on the moon. There were like the tall grays, like the tall ones you see, the
Yeah.
very tall ones. They're kind of like chalky white.
Yeah.
They had those there on the moon. But yeah, like on Mars, you saw primarily mantises and reptiles. But there were like, the Germans had a colony there as well, and that was like a big thing we did, was just kind of stay right around Mars and stay right around there and just wait for our next mission.
Did you see the surface? Were you standing on the surface at any point?
Yeah, and it was just kind of like like a desert. There were small shrubs, like small bushes. You know what I mean? Near the poles, there were more like you would see snowy areas if you got to the poles, but that was like the only amount of water that you would see was near the poles. Everything else was very dry in the desert.
So standing on the surface, you needed life support, right?
And that's what these suits were for too. Yeah, there was some oxygen, but it would be like trying to run in the Himalayas. You could sit down and talk, and that was fine. But if you tried to run or anything like that, you'd pass out from oxygen deprivation. So you had like these suits on, and these suits would help you jump pretty far. You could jump probably, I don't know, 20 or 30 meters, 20, 30 yards with these suits. You could start running and almost skipping, and you could jump and jump. And I don't really remember if the gravity was much different, maybe slightly less. It wasn't something I really remembered. But yeah, like you could still breathe, but it was just a lot less oxygen than on Earth.
Well, my question is, um, how long were you there, or how long do you think you were there? And when you were on Mars, what were you thinking about the people back home, like your family, your parents? Were you wondering, I wonder why they think I haven't been home in a while? Because had time passed per your perception?
Yeah, time passed, but it was almost having like a regular job or being in boot camp. They would tell you different things like the Earth was destroyed long ago, or it was just the Earth is dead and we're trying to repopulate it. We're trying to get life back into it. They would tell you different stories, and you really didn't know what to believe.
So you
So
just felt like you were deployed.
yeah, it was just yeah. And you were leftover DNA from some sort of massive war they had, and that's how they got a hold of you, or something. You know what I mean? It was they would tell you all kinds of different stories, and you really didn't know what to believe.
How were you spending your days on Mars? What was the typical day like?
Well, I mean, on Mars, it was just waiting was the typical day, waiting for a mantis that I was looking for to cross my path. I would eat, or I'd go to their homes and I'd take them out directly out of their home. Their home looked almost like adobe huts, kind of like something built out of like you know terrain, sort of like mud or something like that, almost like a mud hut. But I mean, if I wasn't on Mars, I would spend time on the ship, and I mean, I didn't really live on Mars. And most time I spent on Mars was maybe a week, and then I'd go back up into the ship, and
What was the
that
ship like?
their ship was darker, I guess you would say. Not really very dark compared to Solar Warden, but darker. Um, don't remember swastikas. I remember black suns. The black sun symbol. I remember that a lot, like the circle with the lines going
Mm.
through it. And they wore similar uniforms. There was a bridge of the ship. The reptiles, there was like the master of the ship, they called them, which was like the head reptile. But they also had like, a captain, a German captain, but then they called this reptile like the master. And he had like three other reptiles with him, which were like his advisors or something like that. And yeah, they looked kind of almost like not so buzzard like, but more reptile like the Skeksis from Dark Crystal.
Mm.
They appeared to have almost like a hunchback with like a robe that drug behind them. And I mean, it was just you know we were kind of segregated. We were like the lowest class. They called us conscripts, short for conscriptions. Um, you ate like kind of a basic food and like a color coded food almost, like something basic. There was something that resembled meat. It was under a heat light that had like like a knife, a serrated knife that had a chain attached to it, and it was almost like a I don't know, like a self replicating, producing like its own cells, kind of slab of meat that you could cut off, and it would just kind of regrow. And like nobody really liked that, and it was pretty gross. And
Oh, jeez.
yeah, and then they wore pretty much the same uniforms as I said, like the World War II Germans did. Um, I started playing classical guitar when I got there. They already had everything for me. They had like a guitar for me and a foot stand and music and everything. You had your smart glass pads, which are like the smartphones based off of, which they call it like universal ET tech, where all ETs have this, and it's like a clear computer. It looks like a piece of plexiglass, and you put your hands on the corners of it, and just kind of close your eyes, and like clear your mind, and you create like a telepathic link. That's how most of the stuff works. How most ET tech works. What I remember is it's like a telepathic link, and you can get anything you wanted off this computer. And I remember um, most of the guys can only listen to things like classical music and things like that. They want to listen to music, but since I was playing an instrument, I had like all access to anything I wanted to listen to, and I would listen to music, and I played music, and eventually I got up to playing for the Germans. They found that I played guitar, and they had like a bar area where it was like a horseshoe bar with a bartender, and the women stayed at the bar. They sat at the bar, and like they had 4 or 5 round tables with like 4 or 5 seats in each one, and the men sat at the tables, and they would like listen to me play and things like that. And I got pretty, I knew the first officer pretty well, like the second in command of the Germans. I like befriended him, and he was actually the S3, the one I told you about on base, who was like the lieutenant. He was a fourth in command on base, and it seemed like they did this the way that Robert explained it to me, like they kind of kept you on the same ship or in the same area of the moon. It was like they wanted to keep track of you. Like there were other people I knew from the base on the moon, and there were other people in this ship I was on that I knew from the base and things like that. Like they try to keep you kind of close to keep track of you. And I got everything they wanted. I was getting all the mantises they wanted, and eventually, like it led up to them. I requested they wanted me to stay in the Dark Fleet full time. They said, your only family is your mother and your sister. You have no wife and kids. We want you to be in the Dark Fleet full time. So we would like you to join us, basically, is what they said. And I said, I'll do it if I could become a German citizen. And they discussed that for a day, and they said yes. And then I wound up going to the German world. And the German world was very much similar to Earth. It was like subtropical, I would say. They had a beach. I remember that. But the construction was very much like something right out of Germany. Nothing very high, 4 or 5 stories, and it had that same kind of basic like architecture that you would see like not in Berlin. Berlin's more advanced nowadays, but more in like like the Black Forest or like a town like that, like a smaller town. It would look more
So
like
a replication of a Germantown on Mars?
no, in a different world. And I don't know the name of the world. I don't remember the name of the world. But it's almost like one of those things where if you're loyal to the reptiles, they'll give you things. So there's a lot of worlds that aren't inhabited that the reptiles own, and they just will, give them to you if you show your loyalty. So it was just like a different world that was very similar to Earth.
Different planet?
Yeah.
Not a
Was,
different dimension, but a different planet.
well, I guess
Physically.
you would say different dimension in a sense of fit density. It was a fit density world. Yeah. So I mean, it was different dimension in that sense. That's like difficult to explain. Um, but yeah, I mean, it was just a basic world, and the way they dressed very old fashioned, like the 40s, and like the men wear suits and fedoras, and women wear like dresses and pillbox hats, and it was very like old fashioned. And I remember there was like a transportation, like a public transit kind of system where it was like sidewalks that they went kind of slow on a conveyor belt. They sped up as they came along, and then you hit like a main kind of tube, like almost like a subway, but it was almost like you did it through a sidewalk. And you were in a tube, but you were moving very fast, probably 50, 60 miles an hour, but you really couldn't tell. And these holograms would like appear and tell you the next stop, and you could just go off to the side and just kind of hop off on the next sidewalk that would go fast and slow down so you wouldn't fall forward or fall off of it or anything like that. And they also had like a kind of like a tram system, like a train system, but it was like the men kind of took the sidewalk system, and the women and elderly took more like this train system. So it was kind of like segregated in that sense of men and women.
Daryl, this stuff is so wild. It's so intense. Really, it's so I could ask you a million questions. Um, oh, I may not include this in the actual final edit, but they they gave you a guitar. There was a guitar there waiting for you. Was it, I mean, was it a Gretsch? Was it a Yamaha? What was it? Just a nondescript, just an instrument like a guitar that functioned like a guitar?
It was just like a I would probably say like a solid body, like upper mid level kind of classical guitar, like not laminated. It was a decent, several $100 guitar, but
An
classic.
acoustic guitar, right?
Yeah, nylon string.
Did you ask them how they made it or where it came from?
Oh, I mean, they get all kinds of trade, not only from Earth, but and I mean on their own world too. I'm sure they had musicians and things like that. They kept their culture,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, that person who evaluated you at the beginning, um, I remember you said when you announced at the beginning you play guitar, that I think it was William who said, "Oh, they'll like that." I think he was foreseeing that you would be able to entertain people on Mars. Is that correct? You think?
Yeah, the first class petty officer, yeah. And I mean, it's one of those things where the Germans, of course, have music, but a lot of ETs they don't have music in the sense that we have, and they find it extremely fascinating. They find our art, our music very fascinating. They don't really have the concept of like harmony and melody. It's almost like they kind of take the natural sounds of their world, like birds and animals and things like that, and they kind of put them together in like a rhythm, and that's kind of like their music. But as far as just that they themselves actually creating music, it's something like alien to them. They don't really do it.
They do like new age stuff.
Yeah, yeah, it sounds like a like Enya kind of thing. Yeah, with like kind of like animal sounds
Yeah,
and things like.
that's pretty cool too. So Daryl, I the way I discovered you was through David Icke and his lectures and reading his books. In this book here, The Dream, he mentions you, I think about 5 times, 5 different spots, and I've got them marked out here. Um, hopefully I can find them quickly here. Um, I watched an interview on our iconic media platform, a sort of alternate Netflix, and former U.S. Navy officer Daryl D. James, who revealed his experiences in the United States secret space program labeled 20 years back. I say United States, but it's really the program of the no border cult. That's Ike's take. Daryl James said he was stationed at the Royal Air Force Base at St. Magan in Cornwall, England, and not in the United States. That's one spot you mentioned. Trying to see where else here. Let's see where else. Um, Former U.S. Navy officer Daryl D. James said during his iconic account earlier about the secret space program that there was a portal between his underground military base in Cornwall, England, and the moon. So that ties in with what you just said. You just went directly from England to the moon instantaneously.
Yeah, and I was told all underground bases have looking glass technology, that portal capability.
Okay. Former U.S. Navy officer Daryl D. James says in his iconic interview, "What I saw from my own eyes is that they have a machine that can take consciousness from a body, and then another being can be put can put its consciousness into that body, almost like astral projection, and use it like a tool and be able to walk around just like a normal person. Maybe that explains a lot of our politicians like that. That's Ike's additive there. Um, so you spoke earlier about your consciousness being placed in a different body. Would you want to talk about what that process or experience was like?
Well, I remember, the XO said that I had died the third day I was on Mars, and it kind of gave me a bit of a panic attack. And he said you're a clone, and it gave me like a panic attack in the sense of this isn't the real me. It was almost something out of like a sci-fi movie where I just have the memories of Daryl, and I'm not even really Daryl. Like, and I kind of was like, well, why shouldn't I just kill myself right now if I'm not even like really him? And he's like, Daryl, you don't understand. He said they were able to salvage your consciousness. Is how he put it. And I said, well, what does that mean? And he said, your soul, if that makes you feel any better. He said they were able to take like the part that makes me me, is how he kind of explained it, put it in a clone that was exactly like me in every sense of the word, and I just carried on with life. And it's also, and I asked him, I said, do they have to upload any memories into the clone? And he said, no. He said, your consciousness is like your memory. So it's almost like your consciousness kind of interacts with the brain. It's kind of like a way in the body itself, but it's more like all of your memory is in your consciousness. And depending on, you know, how intelligent you are, it depends on how well you can interact with your own soul, with your own consciousness. And that's why they look for like high scores, high IQ scores, is because the more intelligent you are, it's almost like the more you can interact and connect with your own kind of soul, your own consciousness in that sense. But yeah, I remember we got like, well, after he said that, I got the memories back, and it was, we were just overrun by reptiles, and I just remember like a mouth going over my face and then everything going dark. And then I woke up like on the German ship, and I was kind of like in like a tube, like almost like a tube with like a window so you could look out. I was standing up, and it opened up, like, the lid came open, and there was this German nurse, this woman, and she said, like, basically explained to me that I was killed, but they were able to salvage my consciousness and I was cloned. And I remember the first officer told me that, he kind of like sat down with me and said, this is going to be difficult to accept. It's a new kind of reality. And Robert kind of said to me that you kind of lose a part of yourself when things like that happen. Clinical death, isn't that good for you? Being cloned, isn't that good for you? Going into a healing tank, med beds are fine. You can go to a med bed every day, but healing tanks are for more like extensive injuries, and they're not really that good for you either. It's almost like you kind of lose a part of yourself, and it's kind of like making a copy of a copy of a copy, and it gets lighter and lighter every time you do it. And yes, and he kind of took me to the side, and he was like more kind in a sense. He was like a typical, I guess you would say, first officer, where the captain doesn't even talk to you, and the first officer, he's the one that kind of, lets you know what's going on. He interacts with the men more, and he interacts with his people more. He was pretty good at about that. And yeah, he said, trust me. He said, I know it's going to be difficult at first. He said, I know firsthand. Like, he was like telling me that he had been killed before, clone, and his consciousness was put into a new clone.
So you had some kind of injury or illness that you were struck with, and you became unconscious. Is that it? And then you woke up and you were a different you, or in a different body, the same one you have now, but just a clone version with your soul inside it. Is that right?
Exactly. That body was killed, and that body is, the bones of that body are still on Mars, rotting.
Oh,
My
jeez.
original body, yeah. But I like, my soul, my consciousness was able to be, captured, kind of thing. Like, how did he put it? Salvaged. They were able to
Salvage.
salvage my consciousness and put it
How were you killed?
just by, we were overrun by a group of reptiles. They kind of would they kind of put you into situations where you really went that trained. It was only my third day, and I was already like doing things on Mars. It was the third day on Mars, and I was already doing like heavy like combat and things like that. And they really didn't give you a lot of training. You were just considered like expendable. And also, they have technology like this where they can actually, they can salvage your consciousness a lot and just put you into a new clone. And they have clones of you on the ship, just waiting to be used.
Well, it sounds like you're really lucky because from what I'm hearing, you could not or may not necessarily have been given this restorative treatment, because it sounds like some of you were expendable.
Well, I think some of them are just. I think they have backup clones for everybody, but some just get away. The consciousness gets away, and they can't. I don't know how they do it, how they get it, but sometimes they just get away and they can't get the consciousness. But Other times they do.
Now, was it shortly after that you returned to Earth?
No, no. I mean, after that, you know, I went to, the German world, and then I wound up in Solar Warden, and then I was with, the Pleiadians. They had almost like a joint task force with the U.S. Navy, with many militaries around the world, where, the deal was it was their technology, but our materials, and they could commandeer the ship anytime they wanted for any reason. They did that once. And yeah, it's kind of like a joint task force between like positive ETs, primarily them, and others. I remember like Arcturians, I believe is what people call them, like deep blue, like ETs that were very high density, maybe ninth or something, eighth or ninth density.
Well, those are the ones Marina Saren talks about.
Yeah, they have like black eyes, and their pupils kind of look like blue swirling galaxies, and they're like very deep blue. And they can do things like appear on ships. They don't even need craft. Like they can just appear on ships. It's a higher reality.
So physical distance is irrelevant in this universe for those who have the technology or the innate knowledge to take advantage of whatever physics is available and make themselves move from point A to point B without any interim travel.
Well, it was explained. The Robert explained it to me like a cone. He said like the universe. It doesn't look like a cone, but you have to think of it as far as space travel, like a cone. Where we're at the bottom of the cone, so we're like third density. So to get from one end of the universe to the other is nearly impossible. And then you have like fifth density beings, and it's a bit like narrower. The universe is smaller to them. They're just at a higher point of reality. So they still need things like craft, but they can get from one end of the universe to the other. And then you have ninth density beings that are at the tip of the cone, and they just pretty much have to step outside their front door, and they're on the other side. It's like it kind of works like that. It's like the higher consciousness, the higher density you are, the smaller the universe is.
Oh, that's amazing. Incredible. Let's see what else he's got. Okay, page 269. Then there was the experience of secret space program soldier Daryl James. He said that he was talking with someone in the underground base in 2003 about happenings on the moon when there was like a feedback sound in the room. Well, you talked about this. A voice said something like, "You are now in violation of code 5456 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. If you do not stop now, penalties were up to 10 years in prison and $100,000 fine." James asked if there was a speaker in the room, and he was informed that the technology did not require one. "They're listening right now," he was told, and they were told to stop talking. The next day, someone asked him if he heard the voice in the room, and there was no one there. He pointed to the rectangular boxes on satellite towers and was told that they generated an experimental technology called 5G that was able to create a microwave beam. These boxes, Ike says, are now located in public streets. So you actually talked about that earlier.
Yeah, it's almost like a way to bug your house. You could bug someone's house without even having to break in anymore. They can just do it. They don't need to break in when you're not there and put microphones and cameras up anymore. They just do it with the 5G towers.
Yeah. So they have no problem listening to me and you right now,
Oh yeah, and
obviously.
that was something else. Like Robert explained to me, he's like, you have to get something through your head. He said you have no privacy. He said nobody does.
Yeah.
Privacy is a thing of the past. Like you don't have it.
Since you've been back, how do you feel?
I mean, I have a sense of abandonment, I guess you would say, but I've kind of gotten over that. I mean, Robert told me things about the future, and some of that's happened. He told me that what's going to transpire. It can be prolonged, but it can't be stopped. And I've kind of observed certain things, that seem to be true of what he told me. And I don't remember everything he told me, but I do remember a lot. I held on to like pretty much every word, as though my
Yeah.
life depended on it because the way he, opened it up to me. I mean, and it was, I mean, over right now, I mean, I'm content. I mean, say that much. I'm not overly ecstatic, but I'm not overly happy or anything like that. I'm content with my life. I still have hope for the future. I think things are gonna get. I think we hit. Um, he explained to me like looking glass technology is 94% accurate with a you know was it a 4% different outcome and then a 2% variable. That's kind of like how it works. And I think Joe Biden becoming president, they hit that 4% mark. And because I remember when he was looking down my timeline, because he was able to kind of like look at my exact future and not really looking at the looking glass technology. Because he told me he was born in the year 2580 and he was genetically augmented in the womb to be very telepathic, very psychic, all that. He had an over 200 IQ. He was like the only person on base that was smarter than me. And as he was looking down my timeline, he said, Joe Biden becomes president. He was naming off all these names I really didn't know at the time. I didn't know any of these politicians. And he said, that's something we weren't expecting. He said, but it doesn't matter. He said, they can slow it down, but it can't be stopped. It's kind of like how we put it. The can't be stopped part is, we're under satanic rule is how he put it to me. And what satanic rule means is everything's inverted. Those who you think are the good guys, the bad guys, those who you think are the bad guys are the good guys. Everything is completely satanic. Like it just means inversion, order out of chaos. They want to create the greatest amount of chaos. Wipe the population down to 500, a million, like in the Georgia Guidestones before they blew them up.
Hmm.
That's what their plan was. And then those 500 million would be their own personal slaves. And but yeah, that was all stopped. He told me that the gold in the catacombs of the Vatican would be released to the people. It'd be enough to make everybody on Earth 100 millionaire. So they can't like make everybody that wealthy because people still have to work. You're expected to work because there's going to be a lot of infrastructure, a lot of new technology, and everybody has to chip in. Told me that the Library of Alexandria was actually before the Caesar burned it down. He took everything out, all the scrolls and tablets and everything, and it's all in the catacombs of the Vatican. And history is a complete lie.
Hmm.
Where we actually descend from the Atlanteans, and you hear all these old stories and things like that, and they were all true. And he told me evolution is a lie. Viruses aren't real. Bacteria is real, but viruses aren't. Most of the diseases we get are from parasites. That's why they were so terrified of ivermectin, because ivermectin is like a miracle cure. It can pretty much cure most things because we don't understand. And he got to like kind of like parasites are almost like a fourth density kind of like lower astral kind of thing where it's like it's a weird like dark stuff, what I mean? Like diseases and things like that, like what we think of as viruses. It's actually kind of like these parasites. They're a way to kind of like tap into our density so that like the lower fourth kind of astral plane kind of evil spirit type things can actually get to us through like these physical parasite worms and things like that. Like that's kind of how it works. And if you take a dewormer and you get rid of them, then you no longer have like kind of like this in between man that where they can go get into you that way. And it's a lot more spiritual than you think. Like ETs and things like that. It's a lot more spiritual than you think.
It sounds like um, you and I are on a radio wave or a radio frequency, and that these illnesses or parasites are like when an AM radio is kind of in between the two frequencies, and you can kind of hear two at the same time. They drift in and out. It sounds like to me that's the metaphor to what you're describing, that these parasites kind of seep into our reality and affect us physically.
Exactly. And it's like a way for these lower fourth, like astral beings to kind of tap into our energy and kind of kill us, like, a lot, a lot quicker than we should die. Because he told me our true potential is over 800 years. And that's how long the off-world Germans live. Like, we should live over 800 years. Is how long we should live. But it's not only that, but it's like, the chemtrails and the water we drink and the food we eat. Everything is designed to cause us to age prematurely and age too quickly and
Mm.
die before, because they don't want us to realize our true potential. Pretty much, they're fearful that we'll realize our true potential. And if we could live centuries, then that would happen.
Yeah, and for the Old Testament, everyone lived to be 800,000 years old,
Mhm.
according to Scripture. Um, well, you're really intuitive. What do you think is ahead for us? We have a critical election coming up. I find human politics to be disgusting, but we're in this reality. What do you think is coming? It sounds or seems like there's a lot of turbulent stuff ahead. What's your take?
Well, I mean, he told me, like Robert told me, I mean, what I think is happening right now is the main thing is like it's not Trump. So if you're not like a fan of Trump, Robert wasn't a big fan of Trump either. He just kind of said he's all right. Like yeah, he's all right. He's better than Hillary Clinton. Like none of them are really that great. He's kind of like has his opinion of it, but he's all right. And but it's actually the military, and it's not just the United States military. It's Russia, China, India, the top ranking, officers that, you do have like a satanic side and you do have a side that's done with it. So people say, it's the military or it's corporations. Everything's, universe is run by corporations or all these programs are run by corporations. It's like, yes, but these people in these corporations have families and have children and they don't want to go into this death cult where everybody dies, which it seems like is like what they want, like the strange weird death cult, or they just want like a majority of the people on earth to be dead. And in my opinion, like what what's going to happen, and also what I was actually told was Russia will become the next world power, China will become the next economic power. um, Rankings of power systems as far as world powers will go by natural resources. So, like United States and Mexico, United States and Canada will all become one nation. We'll get into a war with Mexico. Populations will be moved. Alaska will go back to Russia because it belongs to them. He told me kind of like what Putin was talking about when he did the Tucker Carlson interview, where he said like, "What are borders? Are we talking about the borders after World War II, or are we talking about pre-World War II borders? Because pre-World War II borders, like Ukraine is ours, and a lot of Eastern Europe is ours. You know what I mean? So we're going to go back to like an older kind of map system and the way things originally were. And yeah, and he said it's just going to be it's as far as what was going to happen originally in our timeline when Hillary Clinton would become president. We would get to a massive nuclear war. United States would fall. It would just be like horrible, just anarchy, chaos for hundreds of years. As I said, order out of chaos. That's what they had planned for us. It's going to be something much better. He told me. He said eventually medbeds will be released.
What will be released?
Medbeds, things like technology. They can pretty much heal most things. They can, age regression is a different technology. I know I've heard lots of people say that medbed technology, there are different medbeds that are age regression. But what I remember is age regression is like a series of injections and it takes weeks to do it. Like it's something that takes they pretty much put you in stasis and it takes you a long time to age regress, like 20 years. They do it 20 years at a time. And yeah, so med beds were released, healing tanks. So things like, childhood disabilities will be a thing of the past. Cancer no longer will be anything we have to worry about. Our lifespans will go up. The air will be clean. The water will be clean. Pointless wars will end. Some wars will begin because, like I said, the map's going to change. Populations are going to be moved. Things like this are going to happen. And that's just like the reality. He kind of said to me that that's going to be the reality in the future, and it'll take several hundred years for us to get to our main goal. But as far as just sickness, pointless sickness being a thing of the past, I think that's going to happen in like my lifetime. As far as children born with disabilities, dying of cancer, or, like I said, our life expectancy will go up a lot higher. I'm not sure if we'll go up to the 800-year true potential that we have, but it'll definitely be hundreds of years as far as what he told me. And it's
So
going to be much better. And the economy is going to be great. You're going to be able to take a vacation anytime you want. We're still going to have a monetary system. It's going to be gold backed. We're not ready for like a complete Star Trek where money is like a thing of the past. We're not at that level yet. They have to slowly kind of get us there with over hundreds and hundreds of years. Otherwise, you're just going to have like kind of like a communist kind of, death camp kind of world where you have to be kind of enlightened enough to be able to go further up to a point where you need no currency at all. But yeah, I mean, he said it's going to be like the 50s, but better as far as economically. He said it's just we're going to have ridiculous. You're going to be able to, pay off a brand new car in like 6 months. You're going to be able to pay off a brand new house in like 3 or 4 years. You know what I mean? We're not going to be owned by debt. Our things aren't going to own us. We're going to own our possessions.
Boy, this is great news. I'm happy to
Mm-hmm.
hear this.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a journey. It's going to take a while, but what you're saying is the ship is starting to turn around right now. Is that correct?
I believe so, yeah. And I think he said what has to happen. He says this has to be difficult, kind of like how he put it. He said you have DNA memory. And a traumatic event will actually cause your DNA memory to remember it. So, you have this COVID thing and these people, they give you these injections and everything else. And family members die of cancer, family members die of clots. But it has to be like they have to sacrifice some people. Otherwise, if it wasn't difficult, if it wasn't like something traumatic to the population of Earth, it would just happen again in 100 years. He said, we could step in right now and we could fix everything, but it would just happen again in 100 years. So you have to actually affect the DNA memory of the people. So something very traumatic, something that's very upsetting to the people, almost like a rebirth kind of has to happen. And then that way it'll be like our children and our children's children will have like this memory of like this traumatic event happening. So it will never happen again. That's basically what has to happen to us. So yeah, it's going to be difficult. And it's, people find it difficult right now, but it has to be, and he also was saying like things like, like Q stuff, like enjoy the show. And he was smiling, like eat your popcorn. Like it's all just a show. Like things have already done, but they have to show you what they had planned to do to you. Like, and they're doing it so quickly now that like people are kind of waking up and saying like, whoa, like, you can't like take my kids from me and, give them surgery, to remove their genitals. You can't do that. Like they're doing in Canada and stuff like that. It's like, it's happening so fast right now that people are just, but it has to be something like that, something, so alarming to the people that it wakes them up.
In your face, because they're talking about offering euthanasia to folks in Canada who have depression. And instead of offering a treatment or hope, they say, well, we can offer you a comfortable death. So that's the kind of stuff that you just referred to as what is waking people up to, hey, wait a minute, what is going on here?
Mm-hmm.
So I think
and
you're right.
It's going to take decades, but they're doing what was going to take decades in just several years. So people will accept things if you do it slowly and kind of in increments and just do it slowly over time, they'll accept it. But if you just do it all at once, the people won't accept it.
Sure, if you throw a frog into a boiling pot of water, he pops right out. But if you boil him slowly, he'll get cooked.
Exactly.
Over
and that's
time.
how they think. They think like 100-year plans. That's how these Satanists think on 100-year plans. Yeah.
Well, Daryl, thanks very much. This has been a really intense interview. A lot of great stuff. I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on.
I think we'll do it again soon. And maybe we can get Mr. Ike involved next time we're together. We'll see what happens.
Hopefully.
I think it's going to happen.
All right. I'll see you there. Thank you.